Hey folks, this is lecture 3 for unit 1. And in this situation, we're going to be taking a look at how do I make things right. And I don't mean you've done something unethical and how do you want to make up for the fact that you did something unethical. That's a totally different situation. That's a different class altogether. But instead, what we're taking a look at is you're making the right decision. We've already looked at ethical theories and we've already looked at ways that people think. Now we're just trying to say, how do we make that right decision one way or another? So, one of the first things that your text talks about is that there are relatively simple decision making tools. And they don't come about just by looking at the situation itself or the different ethical philosophies that you may follow. There could be some much more easy gut level ways to look at it. So, Peter Drucker, great management writer, another writer out there, easily said this one: above all, do no harm. Whatever it is that you do, he essentially was taking a medical philosophy out of this, which is don't do anything that hurts somebody else. Whatever it is that you do, make sure nobody else gets hurt on it. So compare that to the, well, some people get hurt, but look at all the good that is going to come out of this. That kind of rationalization. He tosses that rationalization out and says, don't do any harm to anybody, whatever it is that you do. Laura Nash, I think, comes up with a whole lot of very good things to consider. Now, this is way too developed for what any of us would do if we sat down and we had a decision that had to get made very quickly about whatever was going on. We wouldn't necessarily be able to go through this whole process. So I'm not talking about snap decisions. A fire breaks out, everybody needs to leave. There's no thoughts about this. Well, what would be the best set of actions to take? Forget it. That's not under consideration at all. The thing that's under consideration is how do I save as many lives as possible by getting people out the doors, you know. But what you're set with instead is, you know, what if my business is going downhill and I really need to just close? Well, who's it going to harm? All the people who have jobs. Maybe my customers are going to be harmed. My own family likely will be harmed. All of these things will go out, but would it be better to do that than it would to stay in business and lose a lot more money? Those things are dilemmas that you're faced with. Which person should I hire? Which person should I fire? Should this person be fired for this action that they took? There's a lot of things that show up as dilemmas. Well, Laura Nash comes up with a series of questions just to think about. It's not going to lead you to exactly what the right decision is. It's not a decision tree, folks. It is instead, these are issues to think about. So think first, did you define the problem accurately? Now you might say, well, that's a stupid question. It really is not. Because sometimes people look at things and they're asking the completely wrong question. They are asking a question about should, let's say you have a restaurant and your restaurant is running in the red. You're losing money all the time and you wonder, should I close a certain day? Perhaps the question's not, should I close the restaurant on a certain day? Maybe it is, are my prices correct? Or maybe it is, do people know enough about my restaurant? Am I marketing well? Or is somebody stealing from me? Or Why do I have another blank restaurant when there are so many other blank restaurants out there, whatever kind of restaurant it is? In other words, did you define is what's really wrong? And it may not be an ethical question at all, but what's really wrong may not be the question that you're looking at in the first place. So go back and look at the problem. Did you define it well? If you were looking at this from somebody else's viewpoint, would you look at it in the same way? That's an awesome question and worth a lot more discussion than we're going to take in this short lecture here. So, this may be something for you to take a look at. What are the different ethical positions that somebody might have on a certain issue, whatever issue that might be? How did it happen? That's a really good question, and sometimes you don't have the answer to it. Sometimes it's not worth pursuing. But how did this happen is quite often an excellent question, not just to be able to understand and be able to ask or define the problem accurately in the first place, but so that you don't make the same mistakes, further on in. What is it you want to get out of this? What's your intention in your decision? And whatever your intention is that going to lead to the result that you really want it to? Are there people that could be hurt by this? Have you talked with those people that are going to be hurt by this? Oh, I don't know if I could talk to them or not. You know what? You really need to talk to those people because they may have some other options for you. They may not be mad, they may completely understand what's going on. They won't be happy about it, but they may completely understand and may have alternatives that you've not even thought about. Could you discuss this with other people? And should you? And which other people? What exceptions under different situations would things be that you might discover? She asks really, really good questions here. And it's not because any one of them will necessarily define the specific right path or decision that you need to take, but it gives you the time and perspective to start making the best decision that you can, which may not be a decision that you like. It may be, but it may not be the decision that you like. But hopefully, you will have made a rational, reasoned, well thought out, good decision that's ethical and reasonable out there. Other things, Blanchard and Peel, is it legal? Well, that's a good first question, too. Is what we're looking at legal? Because if it's not, unless you're doing one of those social protests, then this is probably a quick decision killer right there. Is it balanced? And if you go back to um, John Rawls and some of the others with social contract and justice, that's what we're looking at here. Does it seem to be a balanced decision, or is it heavily in one person's favor or one group's favor, which would be like the ethical egoist, like Ayn Rand would have said? How does it make me feel? Now, I want to tell you that's a good question out there. And in fact, I'm going to ask that question just a little bit with one of my own slides. But those are good things. How do I feel about that decision? Because you generally have gut feelings of things that are right or wrong. And I like what Warren Buffett said. Warren Buffett's really an interesting person to listen to. And he is one of the richest people in the world. And he's one of the most down to earth kind of people. If you just listen to him, I've seen so many interviews and discussions with him. And he just sounds like a general Midwestern run of the mill kind of guy, but he happens to be one of the wealthiest people in the world, and I think he's relatively well grounded out there. And he says, essentially, if it was going to show up on the newspaper and everybody would know about it, would you feel the same way about doing that action as you are looking at here? If not, then you need not be doing that. Then you get the National Enquirer model, which is the same thing, but even more extreme, because you know that headlines on the National Enquirer seem completely outrageous so many, many times. Whether it's truth or not, you see things as like, man with a dog's head found, and that kind of stuff. So if you were to see this, if this were something that might show up on the National Enquirer, the worst possible headline out there, how would you feel about that? I think that's something worth discussing at all. The Wall Street Journal had an interesting way to take a look at it. Same thing as Blanchard and Peel did. Am I in compliance with the law? Is it legal? What are the consequences of my actions and decisions? In other words, if I do this, then what happens? So you've thought about it, you realize what the consequences are, then what contribution will my conduct make to the company and everybody else? So if I do this and consequences are good, is it beneficial to others out there? Is it going to be balanced in its effect that others are also going to benefit? Or is it just me? So the Wall Street Journal test and the Blanchard and Peel test have some similarities in there about how to look at it. Excuse me. Then there's me. And basically, in a college class that I had, a professor said, take a look at these three tests. If you woke up the next day and a headline in the newspaper or in the National Enquirer or on CNN or in Yahoo News or whatever it is, if the next tweet out there had you and this action in it so that everybody would know about it, would you be cool with that? And if that's it, then that's one test being passed. And if not, rethink your action. Secondly, do you get butterflies or a sick feeling in your stomach when you consider doing this? In other words, does it make you stop and think, what in the world am I doing? If that is true, it's something you should rethink. But I like the last one. Could you look your mother in the face if she found out that you'd done this? Because you know what? Not everybody's mother's the same. I know that. But if I had to look my mama in the eyes and she knew that I had done a certain thing, I'd have to bow my head. Now, my mama wouldn't smack me, but she certainly would give me a talking to. And so if you can pass those three things, it doesn't mean that something's necessarily ethical because we all have different situations. Okay, we all grew up differently. But it certainly is one thing to give you pause. If you can pass all three of those things, then it's got a better chance of being something that's ethical. So, what are other things? Well, go back to Kant and the categorical imperative. If everybody else did this, would I feel comfortable with it? If everybody else felt this way, would I feel this way too? Or is this something that's just in my benefit? And then maybe you take a look at the golden rule. The golden rule, as you well know, it's not the rule of gold, okay? But the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so I treat other people the way that I would like to be treated, which is fairly similar to the Kantian view out there as well. Perhaps you also want to take a look at how to do analysis from this standpoint. And this is the end of your Unit 1 text for the ethical analysis. And again, as I said with Laura Nash's stuff, you can't just sit down and say, Okay, I'm going to think each of those things through. But if you step back before an ethical decision or any major decision, and you can go through more or less this kind of a process, you're much more likely to do a better job than if you just seat of the pants, make a decision out there. Know that you have as much information as is reasonable for you to be able to make the best decision possible out there. If there's anything you don't know, what is it? How might you be able to get it or find it out to make a better decision? Everybody who's involved with this, all the stakeholders that are involved, whether it's customers, or employees, or clients, or suppliers, or the community, or your family and friends, or whoever it might be, everybody who's involved with this or has part of the consequences of it, they should be part of that discussion so that they understand if it's that big of a decision, then others need to be involved with it too. Number four, what are the possible ways to resolve this problem? And by talking to others out there, you may increase your possibilities. There may be more opportunities than you thought were out there. Number five, take a look at the cost. And I'm not just talking about money cost. I'm also talking about, as they say here, legalities cost, impact, consequences. What are all the downsides and what are all the upsides? And evaluate those out. Now, this is utilitarian. Remember, when I was discussing utilitarianism back when we were looking at different theoretical options, uh, philosophies, that I said if you took a sheet of paper and you drew a line down the middle and you said, option A, here's all the positives and negatives, and option B, here's all the positives and negatives. That's the same kind of thing right here. The last one is make the recommendation on the action that should be taken. Once you have done all these things, you got all the information you could, you talked to everybody involved to get input and opinions and all of that. You figured out what your options are, you figured out what the consequences and costs are, then you can make a best recommendation about that. And I can't tell you any better, folks. That makes a lot of sense to me as different steps. Thanks for listening.